Screen capture 9.2 on photosynthesis. In the last screen capture video I ran out of time and I was talking about the chloroplast, and you see the granum here with the thylakoids making up the granum, and light comes in, visible light as we think of it, comes in and hits the chloroplast. Green light is not absorbed, it's reflected, and so the chloroplast and therefore the leaf tends to look green. The other wavelengths of light are absorbed, and if you were to study photosynthesis in greater depth, you would note that there are two specific wavelengths that are absorbed in different types of chlorophyll to absorb those two different types of wavelength. The visible light being a kinetic energy, and when the kinetic energy in the form of light is picked up, it's used to break down water and to form ATP and NADPH. Then it becomes a potential energy, an energy of position, or stored in the bonds of the atoms and the molecules. As I talk about photosynthesis, and especially talk about the light-dependent reactions, we have what's called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. We generally think of photosystem 2 occurring first and then photosystem 1. People might ask, why don't they name photosystem 2 1 and photosystem 1 2? Well, evolutionists would claim that the photosystem 1 evolved before photosystem 2, even though photosystem 2 occurs before photosystem 1. But because of that thinking, that's why they're named as such. So don't want that to be confusing, but that's the reason given. Light energy hits chlorophyll, and it happens to be a chlorophyll 680. That helps to describe the wavelength of light that is absorbed. Electrons are excited, water is broken down, oxygen is released, and those electrons are excited to a higher energy level, and then they go through the thylakoid membrane, and that's where an electron transport chain is. If you remember in the last unit, I had mentioned anytime you think of electron transport chain, couple that in your mind with a membrane. There's some kind of a membrane involved. And because ATP is being produced in this electron transport chain across a membrane, it's a chemiosmotic phosphorylation. ATP is produced. The phosphate is added to the ADP to form ATP. It's by chemiosmosis, chemiosmotic phosphorylation. The electron or electrons are eventually picked up by chlorophyll, designated P700, different wavelength that it absorbs in the thylakoid membrane. This is hit by more light, different wavelength of light, and the electrons are excited to a higher energy level. And if there's NADP to pick up the electrons go through an electron transport chain. They're picked up by NADP to form NADPH. That would be a non-cyclic electron pathway. If there's not enough NADP, then these electrons that are excited to this higher energy level from photosystem 1 get cycled back into the electron transport chain from the photosystem 2. They travel down the chain, energy is transformed, given off, and absorbed by ADP and the P to form ATP. That would be a non-cyclic electron pathway. And in the non-cyclic electron pathway, only ATP is formed. So only in the cyclic ATP is, or I should say in the cyclic only ATP is formed. In the non-cyclic pathway, both ATP and NADPH are formed. You might need to take a little bit more notes on this unit than you have in the past. I don't have a lot of typed out words or phrases for you. I do note here, know where the chemiosmosis occurs. It's something you should just know from the last unit. So in the chloroplast you have the thylakoid and you have the stroma. Stroma is a watery portion. And what's being shown across the thylakoid membrane, this is the thylakoid membrane, similar to a plasma membrane. You have the chemiosmosis that's occurring, and NADPH is being formed, as well as ATP. Different processes, both are chemiosmotic events, but NADPH is formed here and ATP is formed over here. This brings us to the light-independent reactions, or what used to be called the dark reactions, and more recent texts called the Calvin cycle, after Dr. Calvin, who studied it. The general overview is that carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH are put in, and with the ATP and NADPH being oxidized, energy is given off to help reform the carbon dioxide and form some kind of a carbohydrate, such as glucose. And this is a carbon fixation event, sometimes described as carbon fixation, going from the inorganic carbon to an organic carbon. And that's what's happening here. Do not expect you to know the PGA or the ribulose biphosphate, the intermediates. That's not so important. In general, carbon dioxide goes in, ATP and NADPH are oxidized or broken down. That provides energy for the buildup of this carbohydrate, and then this carbohydrate can be used in whatever the plant needs it. But this is a part of photosynthesis, the glucose molecule being produced. And these carbons are just cycled around and used up and built up. So the general overview is the sun, which is the ultimate energy source, or some artificial light, is going to be running the light reactions. Photosystem 2, photosystem 1, the non-cyclic and cyclic electron pathways. Water goes in, oxygen is released, and energy is transformed from this kinetic light energy to potential chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. The ATP and NADPH help run the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle is just happening out in the stroma. Carbon dioxide goes in, and it's converted to sugars, which can be used for aerobic respiration, building up plant material in the form of cellulose, building up storage material for energy source for seeds, starches, and a number of other chemicals. I don't go into a lot of detail here, but there are different types of plants. There are C3 plants, there's C4 plants, and there are crassulucian acid metabolism plants, CAM plants for short. C3 plants are most of the plants we think about in our area. And in the Calvin cycle, it runs pretty much as I mentioned. There's a 2-carbon compound that eventually gets produced in the Calvin cycle. It's coming out of it. With the C4 plants, there's an intermediate 4-carbon compound that is produced where the carbon dioxide is fixed to this 4-carbon compound that can go into the Calvin cycle. The big benefit of the way that photosynthesis runs for C4 plants is that they're more efficient in lower moisture conditions. During the hot days, dry days of summer in late July, August, C4 plants will outcompete C3 plants. If there's plenty of water, C3 plants outcompete C4 plants. A good example of C4 plants would be crabgrass, corn. Those are some that come to mind rather quickly, and they do well in the hot, late summer months of the year when it's dry. And corn has actually been genetically engineered to have certain characteristics to make it even more adapted, survivable, so to speak, in hot, dry conditions. The third plant, the crassulucent acid metabolism plant, the best example of this that I can give would be cacti. Desert plants would tend to be crassulucent acid metabolism plants. I refer to them as CAM plants for short. What's different in the CAM plants from the C4 plants is that the carbon dioxide is fixed at night. The stomates of the cactus blades will open up at night when it's not as hot and there's less evaporation, so the cactus is much better at conserving water. The carbon dioxide is fixed to a 4-carbon compound, and then during the day it can run the Calvin cycle, which in other plants the Calvin cycle it can run at night, and in many cases does. The CAM plants are limited by how much carbon dioxide is taken in during the night, because during the day the stomates close up to conserve water, so only the carbon dioxide that's been taken in during the night goes to produce carbohydrates. So CAM plants are slow-growing plants, and that's okay for where they survive. They survive in low water conditions where C4 plants, and especially C3 plants, would not be able to survive. So they outcompete those types of plants where they live. And when you think of cacti, you think of deserts. That's one place where there's less water. Also where the water is frozen or it percolates through the soil quickly, it doesn't stay in the soil. Some of the gravelly areas in Wyoming, and even up into Montana. Montana has some of the coldest temperatures in the 48 contiguous states. And you'll find cacti growing there. I remember visiting the Little Bighorn Battle Monument. It's a national park now in Montana, and seeing cacti there in Montana. If you go out along the seashore on the eastern side of the United States, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, it will freeze in the winter, but you'll have many cacti growing in the sand that can survive where the C4 and C3 plants don't survive so well. You can even grow them in Illinois. It's just you have to keep them weeded, otherwise our C4 and C3 plants will overgrow them and choke them out. But I've had them growing outside and survive the winter temperatures even here in Illinois. Well, I think that is pretty much what I needed to cover. This is not an especially long unit, but you should be able to do well on the test with what I've mentioned to you, and hopefully you've picked up what I've discussed and hopefully even jotted down notes which will help you for the test. I hope you do well.